Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining our MPLCC Science Management webinar this morning. I'm the coordinator for the North Pacific LCC, and we're really excited to have this presentation today done on a project that we funded, I think it was back in 2014. And it was really a very cool project, and we're thrilled that Gwen, Jessica, and David are presenting the results today. It was really focused around how you pull together people working collaboratively across multiple ownerships, and in this case it's Southern Oregon, to look at linking climate-related vulnerabilities with specific adaptation strategies and tactics on the ground, stressing that linkages between adaptation, restoration, planning, and resource monitoring across a multitude of ownerships. So I'm really excited to help open this session today. With us this morning, we have Gwen Meyer, who's a social scientist and a graduate research assistant in academia and the private sector, and she authored the Rogue Basin Action Plan for Resilient Watersheds and Forests in a Changing Climate. Second, we'll have Dave Peterson speak. He's a senior research biologist with the Forest Service PNW Research Station, conducted numerous studies on fire science, published over 220 articles and 4 books on this topic, and is well known in the climate forest environment. And also we have Jessica Halowski, who's a research ecologist with UW, and is affiliated with the Forest Service PNW Research Station as well, and has done a tremendous amount of work with fire and disturbance ecology in the region. So again, we have attendees from all over the North Pacific LCC footprint and beyond, federal agencies, state agencies, tribes, First Nations, Canadian partners as well. So again, I welcome you all, and I'm looking forward to the conversation today.
Thanks, John. So Gwen, you're presenting first, correct? I just passed you the ball so you can share your screen. You there, Gwen?
Hi, yeah, sorry, talking to mute.
That's okay.
Can you see my screen? Because I saw that I was a presenter, but I don't see the little, share your screen button.
There should have been a pop-up that popped up somewhere. Sometimes it gets confused and goes behind your WebEx window. If you minimize that, you might be able to find it.
You might be able to go up to share my screen up at the top, too.
Okay, yeah, I'll try that because I'm not seeing it. Share my screen.
There you go.
Can you see me now? All right.
We sure can.
Sorry about that little glitch, everybody. Thanks for coming to the presentation, and I'm Gwen Meyer. John already introduced us, and our project is implementing climate-smart resource management across multiple ownerships in southwestern Oregon. And a little bit about SOFR, whom I was working with on this project. There's the Southern Oregon Forest Restoration Collaborative. We're a collaborative made up of a lot of different groups from a lot of different backgrounds. People are always welcome to attend meetings and join on projects. And then our board and technical team are made up of members from the Nature Conservancy, agencies, the BLM, the Forest Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, both active and retired, Oregon Department of Forestry. Our current board president works a lot with small woodland owners and is with OSU Extension, local environmental nonprofit groups, local forestry groups, social scientists, resource managers, local academia. So it's a variety of people that we work with. The idea to develop this collaborative began in 2005, and it became an actual collaborative in 2009 to get these people working together on some of the challenges that we face in Southern Oregon. And so at the time of this project, we had pretty recently finished this Rogue Basin Climate Action Plan for Resilient Watersheds and Forests in a Changing Climate, and it looked at the key stressors from water, economics, and forest standpoints, and then brought in, the public, figured out what those key stressors were, working with scientists and others, and then developed mitigation measures and adaptation measures for this action plan. We also were in the midst of writing what was just very recently completed now, this Rogue Basin Cohesive Forest Restoration Strategy, which mainly looks at wildfire risk mitigation and ecological restoration need for land management. And we looked at local fire community risk, large wildfire community risk, landscape resilience, northern spotted owl habitat, climate resilient settings, looking at places that were highly biodiverse, that could remain highly biodiverse through climate change, even though the species themselves may shift. Also, climate corridors and, where doing some work might help in climate resilience. So that was ongoing during this project, and we just recently finished that, and it's on our website at sofrc.org. So where is this place I'm talking about, the Rogue Basin? And it's in southwestern Oregon. You can see the little purple on the top left of the screen there in terms of where it is in Oregon. And then when you zoom in, this is the purple outline of it here. Over 2/3 of the land is federally owned by the BLM or the Forest Service mostly. And then there's some private land and state and government land and a little bit of tribal land in there as well. But you can see, for those of you that aren't familiar with southwest Oregon, there's a very checkerboarded landscape from old railroad lands. So it makes land management challenging, but also necessarily collaborative with both private and federal landowners. So when we came up with this idea to do this project of implementing climate-smart resource management, when Dave called me about doing a vulnerability assessment, he had heard about the climate change plan, and he and I started talking about, what would be the best work that for this grant that NPLCC had that could move forward on the climate plan and help getting some more climate adaptation strategies on the ground. Jessica Holofsky was involved in that conversation as well, Carrie Metlin from the Nature Conservancy, and some others. And we wanted to implement recommendations from the Climate Action Plan that was in place. We wanted to link some vulnerabilities with specific adaptation strategies on the ground, and also link adaptation with restoration planning and resource monitoring programs across not just federal land, but multiple land ownerships. And so for the purpose of this project, we decided to focus that with the federal land managers, in part because they own so much land, in part because it was a way to get something happening on the ground that could be used as demonstration for other landowners, and also in part because during the writing of the Climate Action Plan that I had done right before this, a lot of what was coming up, and a lot of what was coming up with the SOFRC strategy as well, were that these agencies were getting these sort of top-down messages of you have to do this climate change work, but they weren't getting funding for it. They weren't getting time allotted to spend on it, and it was sort of a newer idea, and so they were having trouble kind of fitting it in to everything else they had going on because they had a lot of work and weren't sure how to incorporate it into their work on the ground. And so we wanted to try to make a way from the ground up where they might be able to do some of this climate change adaptation strategies with projects without necessarily having to make major changes to what they were doing. And so part of that was developing a science manager partnership that was already developed through SOFRC, but we strengthened it and worked with science and managers and had that as a part of the workshop. So we had resource managers and agency personnel invited, along with scientists that have been working on climate change in specific regions of climate change there at the workshop so that they could have that dialogue and discussion. And we also set it up with, smaller groups at the end, specific to resource area focus, so that there was a better opportunity for those conversations or questions to be asked and conversations to be had. We did the vulnerability assessment of forest resources to climate change, so drawing from the climate plan, drawing from the SOFRC strategy, and adding to that. That was more suitable for how agencies do their vulnerability assessments. The communication of climate change information, we held webinars prior to the workshop that had specific resource focus. So we did one that was just sort of like 101 climate change basic information, and then we had one that was focused on forests and vegetation. We had one that was focused on aquatic resources, and one that was focused on wildlife and habitats, and then one about restoring resilient landscapes that brought in what the SOFRC strategy was and how that was, what kind of science was used to develop that. So the idea was that we were able to hit, different resource managers' focus in their work, and they could choose which webinar to attend and ask questions to, the scientists that have been working on this with climate change. And then we wanted hands-on development of adaptation options that were tangible and applicable. So instead of doing a workshop where they had hands-on work, filling out a worksheet of a hypothetical situation that would never be used necessarily because it's a hypothetical situation, we wanted something that was real. And so we took a project that was happening in the Applegate Adaptive Management area that they were in the planning phases of, brought their objectives out, brought their resource manager and people that were working on it and had them provide us some of their objectives and what they were doing on the ground, and then broke out into tables based on resource area focus and had those resource specialists look at those after having learned about the climate change adaptation options and the climate change vulnerabilities, and assess what they might do differently or how they might change some of those on-the-ground tactics to be better adapted for climate change. And there's some really good conversations that came out from that. And then we also wanted something that they could see right after the workshop that was also tangible. So we took them to a field trip of a project at the Table Rocks that there's a climate change focused project. So from the very beginning, it was looking at climate change adaptation, using climate science at the beginning of the planning of that project, rather than having already had a project and then looking at climate change as an afterthought. And so the idea was to try to work with these resource managers and work with these scientists to start looking at projects through that climate change lens at the beginning as they're developing what they might do on the ground.
Well, thank you, Gwen, for kicking us off there. We're very fortunate to have the opportunity to work with Gwen and some other excellent folks in southern Oregon who are already engaged in this interface between climate change and restoration, which is kind of where the action is at for what happens on the ground. So this is a really good opportunity to take science and put it into practice. What I'd like to do now is to set the stage a little bit for the project outcomes, which were adaptation to climate change, with some assessment of expected climate change effects in southwest Oregon. And some of this information will be rather familiar to a lot of you, so we'll go through it fairly quickly and try to land on the pieces that are most relevant for this particular project. So what you see here are projections of future temperature from the National Climate Assessment. Everybody's kind of familiar with this. We tend to gravitate towards the RCP 8.5, which is the higher end emission scenario, and that's the trajectory we're on currently. And if you look at the entire Pacific West Coast there, you see that we're in this kind of 7 to 9 degree change later in the century. We look at precipitation. This is something we're much less confident about in terms of projections. Much of North America is projected to have precipitation increases in the winter, at least, in spring in the future. But much of the country is also projected to have decreases in precipitation in the summer. For the Pacific Northwest, that's the time that really counts. It doesn't help us to have more rain in the winter that much, and it really is a bad thing if we have less rain in the summer. And southern Oregon is kind of at the epicenter of that projection of precipitation decrease in future summers. This slide indicates projected snowpack declines for a 3-degree increase in winter temperature. Each little block shows a particular snowtel site, I believe, or a particular weather station, and it shows the fractional change in the future for April 1st. What's SWE? I can't remember. Snow water equivalent. Excuse me. had a brain lapse there for a second. So you can see in southern Oregon, the reddish squares are mostly the lower elevation sites that basically will not have snow anymore in the early spring. Some of the higher elevation sites there, the green, the beige colors, will still have snow, but quite a bit less in the future. So this is something that's already happening and will continue to occur in the future. These are particular snowtel sites in the Rogue Basin area. Again, the red dots are the lower elevation sites that are expected to have very little snow in the future, and the greenish and yellow dots are the higher elevation sites that will have less, but will still continue to have some snow. Now, of course, all this interfaces with the effects of climate change on fire. This whole combination of earlier snowmelt, higher temperatures in the summer, lower fuel moistures, longer fire seasons, is really kind of a game changer in terms of the effects of disturbance and extreme events in this area. We can look at this data here, which is actually from the Cascades in Washington, but it covers a wide range of both moist and dry forest types. A lot of data here. Try not to go into it too deeply. The graph on the left side shows precipitation and temperature with respect to fire size. So basically, the larger the circle, the larger the fire area, and it's probably not all that surprising that when you have years which have low precipitation and high temperature, you have larger fires. The good thing about this is, even though it's not rocket science, it's predictable. We can quantify it. The figure on the right shows severity as a function of fire size, and what we see is this correlation that when fire size is large, severity also tends to be larger, but particularly for certain forest types, like the one with the little diamond, cold, dry forest, particularly seems to jump out as one that has higher severity when fire size is larger. So there'll be a lot of variability as shown in this graph, but we can have pretty good faith in these general correlations. The other thing that we're becoming increasingly aware of, especially after the year 2015, is the influence of synchronicity of regional events, particularly wildfire. 2015 was the so-called year without snow. We had over 1 million acres burned in Washington that year. I can't remember the figure for Oregon, but it was also high. And we had a record fire area burned for the entire western U.S. that year. These are the ecological bottlenecks that we'll be facing in the future. And this may become a lot more common in the future as the temperature continues to increase. Here's some projections for the Northwest, and in this case, the Northwest includes Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and western Montana. And we see this general increase over time into the future of area burned, regardless of which particular global climate model you use. And we go from the historical range of about 500,000 acres per year up to 2 million acres per year later in the 21st century. Again, this is really quite a game changer in terms of how disturbance will affect large landscapes in the Northwest. A little bit more specific, the upper graph is kind of more of the same. This is projection for about the mid-century mark, and we see the Southwest Oregon is down there in the kind of 300 to 400% increase in area burned. We also need to consider other kinds of disturbances. Mountain pine beetle has been a big player in terms of ecological disturbance in forests over the last 20 years. Maybe not as big of a presence in southern Oregon, although we do see a pretty big blotch down there in terms of potential future effects. So this is a little bit of a wild card, but we also need to be aware of the interaction of disturbances, not just fire, not just insects, not just drought. Another really interesting issue is the effect of these large fires. Now, this is a map of the Biscuit Fire, which occurred 15 years ago now. It was about 500,000 acres, largest fire in Oregon history, and it has made a big footprint on that landscape. And when you have areas of severe fire, as shown here, and you have large areas where the seed source for future regeneration is essentially removed or becomes very rare, that's a big challenge for regeneration. Again, these large, rare events may be a significant bottleneck. It may be the most important thing that affects future regeneration and thus future species composition. So if we look at this in kind of a general conceptual diagram, it's all about disturbance and interaction with vegetation and climate. So we can go via a slow route, as shown there on the right side of this figure, where we can get habitat changes occurring very gradually over time, or we can take the fast route in which fire and other kinds of disturbances drive the changes in species composition. And I think it's almost inevitable that in most cases we'll be taking that faster route on the left side of this figure. So we know quite a bit about the ecology of individual plant species, and thermal constraints are critical. Water constraints are probably more critical for most plant species. And again, as we've just been discussing, disturbance regimes as well are kind of the thing that clears the slate and allows these species changes to occur. A recent study done by Susan Harrison was very interesting. She looked at previous data for understory herbaceous communities in southwest Oregon. These were data collected by Robert Whitaker, who is sort of the archdruid of plant ecology in the 20th century. So she re-looked at his plots, analyzed the data, and found that at least in some of the lower montane forests, there was a significant reduction in leaf area over the last 60 years or so. And she interprets this to mean that as conditions have become drier, plants have become less productive. This was not true at higher elevations, only at lower elevations, so it kind of makes sense. And so having these kinds of data sets allows us to continue to look at these same places over time to see if they continue to change in response to higher temperatures. This is an indication of how oak habitat could change in the future. Some work that was led by the Nature Conservancy, in this case white oak and black oak. The yellow indicates areas that are retained with a warmer climate. The pink indicates potential areas of habitat loss. I think there's probably a lot of uncertainty on how this will actually play out across the landscape, again, subject to the effects of disturbances such as wildfire. But it gives us an opportunity to kind of think about what future landscapes might look like, even species that we consider to be fairly drought tolerant, like oaks. This is another approach to projecting vegetation change in southwest Oregon using state and transition models. The big yellow area up there is white fir, which we expect to decline in the future. The big green area is Douglas fir, and even though it's a fairly drought-tolerant tree, that's expected to decline. The big pinkish area there is tan oak, which is projected to increase significantly. So those of you who like to thrash around through dense tan oak stands are going to have a good time in the future. I say that as a joke, of course, but again, it gives us something to think about in terms of what these future landscapes could look like, especially if they are basically instigated by an increase in fire occurrence. So let's switch now to Jessica, who's going to tell us about how all this information was used on the landscape to assist with climate change adaptation.
Great. So as Gwen mentioned, we presented a lot of this information to land managers in a workshop setting, and we used it to evaluate a specific project in southwestern Oregon called the Applegate Adaptive Management Area. So this is a joint Forest Service and BLM managed watershed. It's in the kind of light brown outline here at the kind of south central portion of that study area. And so the federal project team had already developed the goals, objectives, and the general project activities prior to the workshop. We had the team members from the project present at the workshop to answer questions and give more information about the project. And then we had people break out into small groups by resource area, but think about a series of questions. And so these were taken from something called the Climate Project Screening Tool, which was developed to look at Forest Service projects to evaluate them and their potential outcomes under a changing climate. So specifically, we asked, given what you've just heard about potential effects of climate change, what do you see as the challenges in meeting the goals and objectives of your project? And then how might project activities need to be revised when you think about these potential changes? And also, how would these new approaches compare in terms of how effective they are or how feasible they are compared to your original activities? And so I'm going to go through the outcome of this exercise. I'm going to give project goals and then talk about potential challenges to those and then some adaptation tactics related to those. So one of the main project goals was to make sure plantations were restored to more resilient conditions. Some challenges associated with that. The plantation stock might not be very well adapted to future climatic conditions. And then, of course, we have increased risk of fire and drought in the region with warming temperatures. So the work groups identified a couple of tactics or revisions to project activities. One was to further reduce stand densities. They talked about specifically large pine trees. You could thin around those using radial or donut thinning. And you could specifically target plantations that might threaten more resilient areas around them. You can also think about the planting stock in plantations and think about diversifying both the genotypes and the species to increase future resilience. They also stress the importance of using prescribed fire because of its effectiveness in reducing future fire risk. So they thought about these revised activities, and they said in terms of feasibility, these would likely be more expensive, but they will likely decrease fire risk and the incidence of insect and disease outbreaks. There's also the long-term maintenance issue. They have to repeatedly go back and do field treatments and reduce stand densities to make sure that these treatments are effective over the long term. So another project goal was specifically to reduce fire risk to communities and in other developed areas. And, of course, a challenge would be increased risk of fire in the wildland-urban interface. And so they specifically wanted to focus thinning activities and fuel reduction activities in the wildland-urban interface. Okay, the next goal was to basically reduce the stand conditions that encourage outbreaks of insects and disease. And Dave touched briefly on the fact that we could have increased insect and disease outbreaks, particularly in the stands that are overstocked. We have high density. The drought stress is likely to be greater in those stands. The vigor of the trees is reduced, and then they're more susceptible to insects and disease. And so the adaptation tactics would be to, again, increase the thinning in prescribed fire, reduce the stand density, increase individual tree vigor, and increase their resilience to insect and disease. I specifically wanted to target those older closed canopy stands and pine oak woodlands, the places where fire has likely been absent for a long period of time, and also where they have these shade-tolerant species coming in that increase the fuel loads and the ladder fuels and lead to high-severity fire. In terms of feasibility, it's very difficult to treat a large enough area to have an impact at the landscape scale. So that was one of the major challenges identified. Another is that the windows for prescribed burning are pretty short, and in general, tolerance for smoke is pretty low in surrounding communities. Those are some of the difficulties in implementing these treatments. Okay, so they had several goals related to wildlife habitat as well. This one was to make sure they develop and maintain complex forest habitats for wildlife. Challenges to that, again, increased fire risk, but specifically increased area burned could result in a reduction in legacy structures like snags and down wood that are really important for wildlife habitat. We could also have vegetation type shifts that change the plant community composition and the habitat characteristics for wildlife species. So some of the tactics, one is to make sure to create redundancies in habitat across the landscape. So if a large fire comes through and destroys one area of habitat, that there would be others available. Another key would be to increase habitat connectivity so that wildlife species are able to respond to changes in the landscape and the climate and move around to access habitat. They talked about focusing development of habitat specifically on where it might be most resistant to the effects of climate change. For example, oak woodlands might be more resistant than Douglas fir stands. So maybe you want to focus more effort in those oak woodlands. You might also want to think about favoring certain species depending on where you are in the landscape, for example, on different aspects. So you might want more drought-tolerant pine or oak on those warmer south-facing slopes. They also talked about targeting thinning specifically around legacy trees. So make sure you're removing all those pine needles and flammable material from around the base of those really important trees to make sure that they can survive a fire. So in terms of feasibility, they thought, this might make for some more difficult treatments, might increase costs. You might have to think more about the trees that are selected for retention in thinning activities. And the design of logging systems could potentially be more complicated with these changes. Okay. Another goal of the project was to treat non-native plant species. And we know that with increased disturbance and vegetation type shifts around the landscape, the potential establishment of invasive species could increase. And so some of the things they wanted to do about that, one would be to make sure they seed native species and use locally sourced seed in the project, make sure it's weed-free, and make sure that they're not negatively impacting the existing native species so that those species would be at a disadvantage and less competitive with the non-natives. And also to use early detection, rapid response for non-natives. So this might mean that more monitoring needs to be done for non-native species. And there's potential that new treatments may need to be developed in some cases as well. They wanted to experiment with some of that. Okay, and the last project goal was a general maintaining watershed health goal, specifically related to water quality, habitat, and site productivity. And so the challenges are increased fire risk, but specifically in riparian areas, and the potential effects on the functions that riparian areas provide, and also increased summer drought stress and risk of tree mortality in riparian areas and uplands. So the adaptation tactics, one was to actually allow thinning in riparian areas to increase the tree size and functions like shade and water storage that might help create resilience to climate change. So currently, there's very little thinning activity or no logging activity done in the riparian areas on federal lands. So but they thought that rethinking that might be a good idea in the future. You could also increase the diversity of shrubs and trees in riparian areas, again, to increase the potential resilience of these areas to changing climate. So in terms of feasibility, thinning in riparian areas, you do have to get around the federal regulations and make sure you design treatments that have no effect on water quality and water temperature. So potentially tricky. All right. So overall, for this project, in terms of vulnerabilities in Southwest Oregon related to climate change, as Dave really mentioned, the disturbances are likely to be key, particularly fire and drought. In terms of adaptation, we really saw a big focus on the use of thinning and prescribed fire to reduce the risk of high severity fire and also susceptibility to drought. But we thought that the Science Management Partnership was effective in helping to incorporate the latest science and get it into an on-the-ground project. And we thought that the Climate Project Screening Tool or something along those lines was helpful in helping to facilitate that process. But it was very much a shared learning process. We had our educational tools like the webinars, the workshops, the field trip, but it wasn't a unidirectional learning process. The managers learned about the climate science and the potential impacts, but we also had the scientists learning about the local climate change effects and the management context and the constraints that those managers have, and also the application of that science to a specific on-the-ground project. It was kind of a co-production of knowledge in that way. So we expect that the adaptation ideas that were developed in the workshop will directly influence what happens in the Applegate Adaptive Management Area project. But perhaps more importantly, we think that this whole process helped to increase understanding of potential climate change effects in the region and helped increase the capacity of managers to respond to those effects. And so a couple of products from this work. We did have a paper published in the journal Forest describing this whole process, and so there's more information there, and we will make sure that that gets sent out in the follow-up email. And we mentioned the webinars a couple times. Those are all recorded and available at the SOFRIC website there, and we'll send out that website as well. Another really important outcome of this project, though, was that it helped set the stage for a larger regional scale project that we're currently working on called the Southwest Oregon Adaptation Partnership. And so this is a joint Forest Service, BLM effort. We also have Oregon Caves, National Monument and Preserve involved, the Nature Conservancy, and we have the Cow Creek tribe involved in the effort as well. And so this will be a broader scale vulnerability assessment that will cover hydrology, water use and infrastructure, fisheries, vegetation and disturbance, recreation, and also some other ecosystem services. So it will be an in-depth vulnerability assessment for this region, and then that will set the stage for development of adaptation strategies and tactics in a workshop, which is scheduled for early November in Grants Pass. So there is more information at the website at the bottom. Again, we can send that out for more information. And there will be a resulting general technical report from this effort coming out in probably a little over a year or so. So with that, we'd be happy to answer questions.
Great. Thanks, Jessica and Dave and Gwen, for your presentations. So what we're going to do now for our question period is if anybody has any questions that they want to ask for our presenters, just feel free to use the chat function, and you can send those questions to NPLCC staff, and I will read those questions and I'll ask them to our presenters. You can go ahead and do that whenever. We already have a couple questions, so I'll start with those. The first one is, how applicable are these adaptation tactics to neighboring lands beyond the Applegate AMA?
Yeah, I think they're broadly applicable. Most of them are general enough. I think they could be applied in dry forest regions anywhere in the Pacific Northwest.
Great, thanks. Next question is, has there been progress implementing these workshop recommendations of adaptation tactics in on-the-ground actions by Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Forest Service, or others?
Yeah, so the Applegate Adaptive Management Area project team did take the results of this study, and they are considering it in their process in developing the final project plan for the Applegate AMA. So we expect that to be a direct application of this information on the ground.
Thank you. Okay, so far we don't have any more questions. We'll give people some time to type out their thoughts there. And just a reminder to everyone who's on, if you weren't on earlier, a few things. We will send out a follow-up email to everyone who participated today with presentation slides, contact information for our presenters in case you think of any questions when you're sleeping tonight that you need to get answered. And we also recorded today, so we will have a recording of this webinar available on our YouTube account and at nplcc.org. So we have another question here. What is your definition of climate smart?
Oh, did we use that term? So climate smart would be any, I guess, project on the ground action that has considered the potential effects of climate change and would be, for specific on the ground actions, that action would be one that considers the effects of climate change and would potentially reduce unwanted effects of climate change, help to mitigate those effects.
Yeah, and to that I would add that it would create the conditions either for the ecosystems or for the organization involved that will promote resilience to future negative impacts, as Jessica mentioned, and also to assist with the transition of systems to new conditions. You know, an awful lot of what we will probably experience in the future, we won't be able to resist it, but we might be able to anticipate what those changes will look like and make that a successful transition so we don't lose too much functionality or lose too many ecosystem services in the process.
Thank you. Okay, next question. Is there a need to work with private landowners to implement actions in the wildland-urban interface? If so, what strategies have been identified to work with landowners?
Gwen, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, yes, absolutely. You need to work with private landowners. The SOFERC strategy is one that's starting to work towards that. It prioritized high-risk communities. I think I showed a little image of that to sort of designate where the highest risk communities are. Jackson and Josephine County are some of the highest risk buoy communities. We have had, CWPP's community wildfire protection plans in place and working with watershed councils. And then we are actually currently working on another grant that we hope that we'll get to work with schools in some of these high priority community areas, making the schools fire-wise and having students go out and work with local communities, doing home assessments and presentations to the community about both ecological restoration and fire risk. And then SOFRC's a part of FACNet, the Fire Adapted Communities Network, so we also work with them. And then, like I said, the new board president works with small woodland owners of OSU Extension, and so SOFRC and OSU Extension are partnering. We're partnered on that grant, and we're partnering together to try to work in some of these communities of small woodland owners as well. So there's a lot of different things going out there, and then we also had a workshop with community members after this workshop as a follow-up with community members on the SOFRC strategy and fire risk in their communities. So we hold workshops, we go out there, we're trying to work with the schools also if we get this funding, and then we work with FACNet and FireWise and watershed councils too.
Yeah, I'd have to say that, Gwen and other folks in Southwest Oregon do this better than anybody I have seen in the western U.S. in terms of this interaction between federal, state, and private landowners. And the question that was raised is a very good one, because for any particular forest landscape in the Northwest, maybe half of that land is privately owned. If we break down the private land, about half of that may be commercial forest land, and the other is non-commercial forest land comprised of a lot of smaller forest landowners. In our engagement with industrial forest landowners, they have not expressed a lot of interest because they are on a fairly fixed schedule of management, doing quite often short rotation, maybe 40, 50-year rotation forestry, and they don't see a lot of adjustments they need to make, at least at the current time. I think they're open to making adjustments in the future as the climate continues to warm. And for smaller forest landowners, we often feel fortunate that they do any kind of active management. So at least in a broader perspective across the Northwest, that group has been very difficult to reach, and I think a lot of that is just lack of capacity by extension folks who typically work with them to really kind of get this message out. But that's starting, and I think a successful effort in this particular area of Southwest Oregon may be a good example that others can emulate in the future.
Thanks, Dave. So the next question is actually a great follow-up for the last question. Are there plans to use this work to build public support in the Pacific Northwest for implementing these actions? It seems like with recent fires, an increase in public concern might be happening.
Yeah, so we had that workshop with the public after this workshop as a follow-up to try to get some public support and on board. We've been having community meetings and other workshops as well. And then if we get this grant to work with the schools, we're also going to be going out to the communities and meeting with local community members and fire departments on some of these adaptation strategies. In terms of the SOFRC adaptation plan and then also climate adaptation strategies. So when we met with the community, we met about climate adaptation strategies and the SOFRC plan, kind of similar to like the federal workshop, but not as intensive. And we did write up all the notes from what community members said and then included that as an addendum to the SOFRC strategy in terms of what the community members seem to be prioritizing and the adaptation strategies that they felt would be most effective in their town. So we're making that effort. I think Dave brought up a good point about capacity, though. I think sometimes it's hard because people work and have kids and they have stuff going on. But we do have some timber people on board. Grayback Forestry has been working with us a lot. And I agree, I think, with everything going on. Like, we have the Tech Car bar fire right now that's over 100,000 acres. 7 homes were just burned. And I left Southern Oregon with my kid because the smoke's so bad there right now. So it's definitely something that's affecting the community, and I think that with everything going on, community support for this type of work is increasing as they're seeing the need more and more every year, pretty much.
Thanks. Okay, last question that we have on deck so far is, was there any consideration of determining areas in the watershed that are resistant to projected climate changes, such as refugia?
Yeah, I can take that one. We used a Nature Conservancy project called Landscape Facets or Conserving Nature Stage. It has a couple of different names, and what that does is look at the landscape position and the biodiversity, and it basically identifies potential areas that might conserve biodiversity in the future, so those refugia. And it doesn't necessarily look at species composition because the idea is that may change, but that those are the places that might conserve biodiversity in the future. So we did consider that. That's used in the cohesive forest restoration strategy that Gwen mentioned as well.
Thank you. Okay, so we have no more questions as of now. We have about 4 minutes left, so we can hang out for a little if anyone's still thinking of questions. But again, as a reminder, we will send out contact information, so if anyone is interested in connecting with our presenters, if they want to find out more about the project, ask more questions, or want to connect and get involved, we will make sure you guys all get that information. And again, thank you all for joining us today. It's been great to have everyone on this science management webinar. And we'll hang out for just a couple more minutes